Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast, conversations that connect research with ministry.
My name is Rick Heemstra, host of the Faith Trends Podcast. If you're like me and you've ever watched a Sora video or on a lark asked ChatGPT to write a sermon for you, you've probably had one of two emotions fighting to break the surface. The first is, wow, it can do this. And the second is, well, what am I for? If AI can do what I do, if not as well, it sure looks like it's going to be better soon. This is the first of two podcasts with our guest, Dr. Andy Steiger from Apologetics Canada. In this episode, we'll look at the question, what is AI? And in the next one, we'll ask, what do we do in this AI cultural moment? Please be sure to listen to both episodes as you won't want to miss what Dr. Steiger has to say.
Dr. Andy Steiger, welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast. The big question for this episode of the Faith Trends Podcast is, what is AI? But before we get to that, could you briefly tell us who is Andy Steiger? Tell us about yourself and how you came to be interested in AI as a subject.
Yeah. Thanks. By the way, it's great to be with you. I'm originally from Portland, Oregon, so I am an import into Canada. I've lived here, though, longer than I've lived in the United States, so I think of myself as an honorary Canadian these days, and I am a citizen as well. But I love Canada. I love hiking, love ministry, and thankfully I get to do both of those things here in Canada. And part of my journey in ministry actually led me into studying. I did my BA in Biblical Studies, and then I did a master's degree, and then ultimately a PhD. And when I was doing my PhD, originally, it was actually, by the way, a book by Nancy Pearcey called The Soul of Science, where I came across this guy by the name of Michael Polanyi, who gave a fantastic argument against reductionism, and I was really captured by his philosophical arguments. And ultimately, as I was studying further into this, it brought me into the field of AI, and I'm sure we'll get more into kind of that journey, but it was an unexpected one. However, I've always been interested in the area of technology and artificial intelligence in particular.
Now, just to get the ball rolling on AI, can you give us some examples of where we see artificial intelligence in our daily lives today?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm asked that question quite a bit, and a lot of people don't realize that AI is undergirding a lot of the technology that we interact with on a regular basis. So there are AI algorithms that are involved in social media scrolling, for example, and what kind of content YouTube's going to present to you. It's the technology behind how effective our drones are at flying, but also our airplanes at flying as well use a lot of AI technology. Of course, self-driving cars, but even those of you that enjoy playing video games and are familiar with CPUs and the like, they drive our games as well. So AI technologies are incorporated in a vast array of technology that we use every day.
Now, Andy, some of the platforms that have really hit the news though recently are like ChatGPT, DALL-E, Sora, and sometimes I think that they seem like a bit of a black box. You go to a website, you add your prompt, and what comes back, it just seems amazing that it can do this. And if I'm honest, when I've seen some of this, I was watching some of the Sora demo videos. These are short 1-minute videos that are made just from an AI prompt. I looked at that and my initial reaction was that's witchcraft. And
feels like magic.
Yeah,
right?
It does. And if you listen to AI types, they're always talking about AI models. So what's an AI model? Can you help us to understand that?
Yeah, and by the way, I fully appreciate what you're talking about. I've also been amazed by the technological leaps that have happened, particularly recently. But an AI model, just very simplistically, is a program that's been trained on a set of data to recognize certain patterns or make decisions without further human intervention. So these are models that are being used to achieve specific purposes. And as you mentioned, there are very advanced ones that we're seeing, such as ChatGPT or, text to video like you were talking about. But these come in a wide variety from very simple to very complex.
So could you help us untangle some terms? We have terms like machine learning, artificial intelligence. I just learned about artificial general intelligence. How are they different? And maybe just briefly, what are they?
Yeah, it's always good to kind of figure out the lingo and untangle this at some level. For those that aren't used to these terms, it can feel very easy to get lost in the conversation. But when we're talking about machine learning, for example, these are types of algorithms that are achieving things that we previously haven't been able to achieve. And maybe one of the best ways to try to explain this is with regards to different kinds of knowledge that humans are used to, but sometimes we don't give a lot of thought to. Let me just give you an example. I have a 16-year-old right now. Maybe you guys can relate to this. I'm currently teaching my son how to drive, which is a little terrifying at times. But when you teach your kid how to drive, they have to encounter 3 different types of knowledge in particular. For example, one type of knowledge is being a passenger, right? We'd call that experiential knowledge. They've sat in the back seat. They understand how a car drives. They've seen it. They've experienced it. But no one would say that that kind of knowledge is sufficient to drive a car, right? Now, to get a learner's license, my son had to go and he had to take an exam and he had to pass a test demonstrating a factual knowledge of driving and the rules of the road. But again, no one would say that that is enough to know how to drive a car, that that's not sufficient to drive a vehicle. That's because we would say that there's a third kind of knowledge. We would call this a tacit or a silent doing kind of knowledge. And that is that you actually have to get behind the wheel and you have to actually drive the car. You have to do it. And the more you do it, the more you drive, the better you get at it. There's many kinds of knowledge that are like this, like when I taught my son how to ride a bike, or even earlier when I was teaching him how to walk. These are all tacit, silent, or that doing kind of knowledge. And so when we're talking about machine learning, that's the kind of knowledge we're talking about, is that third doing kind of knowledge. We're talking about machine algorithms that allow technology to learn by doing. And as you can imagine, with that kind of algorithm, it is data heavy. It needs lots of data in the same way that my son needs lots of data or time behind the wheel so that he can process that information and learn how to drive. So let me just stop right there with machine learning, okay, before we jump into the other ones. Is that making sense?
Yeah, I think so. So we've got machines that are taking the leap then to doing something that at least mimics the tacit knowledge that we might gain when we're learning to drive a car. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, and in many ways, they're actually learning from us in many ways on how to do that. But this was a bit of a debate, though, because we didn't know whether or not this was possible to be able to get a machine to be able to do these sorts of things, like playing a game, for example, or driving a car. Was that possible? And we're seeing that in many ways it is possible. Now, what are the limits of that? I mean, that's an open question. But when we start to now get into the area of artificial intelligence, now we're talking about machine learning that has been inspired by the brain, particularly things like our ability to learn, and aspects of cognitive science, such as neural nets and neural networks, for example, where there's certain kinds of ways of processing information, that we now have machines that can simulate things that are very human-like. And so we call this artificial intelligence. And then artificial intelligence, so doing things that are very human-like, can come in a wide variety. Now, I noticed, Lindsay, you were asking about, there's different kinds of AI. And I think you were asking me about narrow AI and general AI. And so just to help people to appreciate that, we're talking about ways in which AI is being used. And one of the first people to kind of coin a distinction in AI was John Searle, with a distinction between weak AI and strong AI. And I've always appreciated his distinction, and it can help you to appreciate the distinction between narrow and general AI as well. So weak AI is where you're inspired by the human brain to train machines to behave in certain ways or think in certain ways, or in the sense of machine learning, where it can accomplish certain tasks, such as playing a game or driving a car. But we would understand that in a weak sense as just a tool helping people, for example, versus strong AI. And by the way, so narrow AI would fit within that weak category, where it's technology that does tasks, that behaves as a tool for humans, versus strong AI, or more of this general AI, is where now the machine starts to take on more of an ontological characteristics, as being viewed more as a human, for example. With regards to artificial general intelligence, though, that one is starting to get nuanced a little bit more, though, these days, where it's saying that the technology or the algorithms can solve problems and learn to adapt similar to humans. So you've got, on the one hand, people saying, okay, it's technology that's behaving similar to humans, versus some would say, in a more stronger sense, it's technology that now has taken on more of that ontological status of being, for example, a mind, or being human in that sense.
Andy, before we just go on, could you just define for our listeners the ontological and what you mean by that? That may not be a word that's familiar.
Yeah, thanks. I should have mentioned that. It's a philosophical term that's just talking about existence. So when we're using the word ontological, we're saying, what's the nature of it? So when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we're saying, then, is the nature of that technology a mind? Is it human, or is it something different? So that's what we're asking. So you can imagine then, between narrow AI and general AI, or weak AI and strong AI, we're talking about, is this a tool that humans are using, or is this a machine that's becoming human?
Okay, that's very helpful. So, Andy, we've been talking about different AI terms, and we've got terms like neural networks, backward propagation, gradient descent, and these all depend on math like linear algebra, calculus, and then Python libraries like PyTorch. So if I'm a pastor, how deep does my understanding of AI and the mechanics, like the way that it works under the hood, have to be in order for me to be a good shepherd of my people as we're talking about and trying to understand AI?
Yeah, I think this is a really practical question that people in ministry, but also people just in general, need to think a little bit more about, in that, very practical, well, how deep do I need to go in this? How much do I need to understand? Because the reality is, artificial intelligence can be quite complicated, and the algorithms that are driving them, although simple in nature, can be quite complicated. And if people feel like they need to understand that, particularly a pastor, I mean, that could be just a black hole of never-ending, searching for more and more knowledge on these systems, where what I would say, Rick, is more important for a pastor to be focused on. And I would even expand that, saying this is what parents need to be thinking about. I'd also say this is what users of the technology need to be thinking about, is what are the more of the end goals of the technology? So on the one hand, it's helpful to understand how it's working, and we'll talk more about that, I'm sure, in this podcast, but what are the effects of it? So I was talking about this, for example, recently with some teenagers. I was giving a talk to teenagers on AI, and just explaining how AI algorithms are working in social platforms, from Instagram to TikTok, and that these algorithms can be very addictive. In fact, when you talk with young people, they often will bring that up. Like, I've met many that have removed themselves from certain platforms because those algorithms, they understand your likes and dislikes so well that they can become very addictive technologies. As well, if you have an addiction to a technology that is drawing you away from people, you can have a very lonely technology. So these are important things for us to understand from a ministry perspective, from a parental perspective, but also from a personal perspective. How is this technology impacting me personally? How's it impacting my family? How's it impacting my ministry? But here's another one maybe to think about. So if we're talking about a pastor here, and maybe there's the temptation for a pastor to be using ChatGPT, for example, to write a sermon or the like, right? And we've all seen the news stories of people, doing that. But imagine that somebody writes a sermon with AI. I think there are theological questions at play that we have to give more thought to with regards to the technology that now is available, and ask questions that perhaps we've never thought of before, like, what's the role of the Holy Spirit in my life? And how is God's presence in my life and my relationship with God, and as the Holy Spirit leads me, guides me, corrects me, and helps me as I'm leading my church and my congregation, and the role of the Holy Spirit actually in us writing a sermon and speaking to people, the relationships that we have with people. I think those are very practical aspects that perhaps a lot of people aren't giving thought to.
Yeah, Neil Postman said that technology always gives something and it always takes something away, and we usually adopt it for what it gives us. And I think he, or maybe Marshall McLuhan, would say we're blind to what it takes away. And it's true. I was thinking of a conversation I had with a friend who's a professor at a university, and a lot of his time is spent finding students who are cheating using AI. And so now we have students that are writing their papers with AI. And then I read that there's also professors that are grading papers with AI. So it just we're just cutting everybody out, right? You can just let the AI machines talk to each other here. And that really goes deep with these ontological questions. You're talking about the role of the Holy Spirit in writing a sermon. Yeah, this is a very good question. Is that important? Or is ChatGPT good enough?
I was actually talking with a friend about this very thing, Rick, where he was bragging to me about how he had used ChatGPT to write a book in a day. And I remember thinking, well, what, like, I don't know if that's something to be excited about. I then retorted to him. I said, yeah, it's so great. I can have ChatGPT read that book for me in a day too, right? And he's like, well, what have we really accomplished here? We've really just cut each other out of the whole process of living if we're not careful. So it's kind of interesting from my perspective. One of I think the concerns that we should have, particularly as pastors, is the role of relationship in our lives, the role of our relationship with God in our lives, as we were talking about with the Holy Spirit, and also the role of other people in our lives. And I think this is a key question that we've got to be asking. Curious your guys' thoughts on this one. But I think that we should constantly be asking ourselves when we use technology is, how is this technology helping my relationship with God and helping my relationship with people? How is it detracting from my relationship with God and detracting from my relationship with people? I think those are important questions for us if we're going to navigate well the technological future that's before us.
I wonder if we can accurately evaluate that if we have the illusion of relationship, though. Especially I'm thinking of through social media, if you feel so connected and you have the illusion of relating to all of these people, even though it's mediated through a screen and an algorithm, do you think they even have the tools to evaluate their relationships?
I agree with you. This is one of the challenges that we have, is that we can get so lost in our technology that it can be difficult to find our way out of it. I don't know if you've read Sherry Turkle's work. She wrote a book called Alone Together, and she talks about outsourcing our humanity to technology. And you could get yourself into a situation that you don't even realize that you have now swapped real relationship for artificial relationships. Mm-hmm. So I agree with you. I think that's a real danger. And I mean, people need to watch a movie to think about this more. WALL-E, was quite prophetic, I think, in many ways, because it was challenging that.
That's right. So I think one thing that makes technology intimidating to engage with and to evaluate is this idea that it's not static. It's always changing. So if you look through any of the research on social media, you see that a lot changed with the rise of the smartphone, the introduction of the smartphone. And then Rick had sent me a podcast where Blaise Aguera from Google, he talks about how something sort of shifted in 2019 with AI from the supervised learning to unsupervised learning. So do you have any theories about why 2019 was this inflection point?
Yeah, I do. Now, here's my thoughts on that. Now, first of all, I don't know that anybody could tell you exactly why 2019 was so significant. However, I would say that there are a number of factors that were at play and have been at play for some time. We need to appreciate that technology has been advancing at a rapid rate. And in fact, it's been advancing at an exponential rate. That you can watch on a bell curve that exponential growth factor where as technology began to take off, It was very slow in its progression and technological advancements. It might surprise listeners to learn that our AI algorithms aren't new. They're actually pretty old. That shocked me in my doctoral work, that a lot of the AI algorithms we use were invented in the 70s. And in fact, I've even seen other algorithms that date back to the 50s. Like, they're old. The challenge was not the algorithms. We knew we had that figured out. The issue was we had two things that we needed to figure out. We needed to get the data, and we needed to have the computational power to process that data. And that was what was key. Because remember, if we go back to the illustration of my son driving a car, remember, if he's going to learn to drive a car, he needs lots of data. I got to take him out all the time driving. So you have to have the information to process, but then you need to have the mind or the computational power to process that data. We didn't have either. We were developing the data very slowly and the computational power to process that data very slowly. Now, with regards to the exponential growth factor of technology, though, that began to advance quite rapidly, where we saw, various things take place. We saw IBM's Deep Blue beat the world's best chess player, back in the late 90s. Then we saw Watson beat the best Jeopardy players, right? And then we saw AlphaGo beat the best Go player. And then we saw AlphaGo Zero beat AlphaGo. Right now, humans suck at games so much that in comparison that now the AI algorithms have to play each other, sort of idea. But my point is, I think you can appreciate that what we're talking about by 2019, I would argue there was nothing special about 2019 other than we now have the data and we have the computational power, and 2019 was a real convergence of those two when we were able to make some significant leaps forward technologically, and are continuing to, and they're going to happen as we've been seeing. Even if you just track from Deep Blue to AlphaGo Zero, those have progressed at an exponential rate that has even shocked the AI community. Because I remember watching AlphaGo beat the best Go player, and I remember them thinking that was going to take 10 years to make that leap, and it happened within a year.
Yeah, if you listen to AI leaders talk now, they'll talk about compute, which is a little bit like the way we talk about electricity, like megawatts or whatever. It's simply a measure of computational power that you throw at a subject. I've always been struck by, I think it's attributed to Joseph Stalin, who was a bit of a monster, but he was asked, people were sizing up their relative size of their armies and strength. And I think some people in the West were saying, we have better machinery. And Stalin was basically saying, well, quantity is a quality all its own, and I have more tanks. So that sort of adjusts for the quality. But I think that when our compute went up, we hit this qualitative threshold over which we've gone now. And I think that's what we're seeing.
By the way, on that note, which something might be interesting, just when you're talking about computation, or we talk about computers, right, that are computing, it's just fascinating that in the past, when you're talking about, like if you read documents from the 50s, computer referenced a person, because that's what people did. People were the ones that were the computing power. They crunched the numbers. Now a computer, it's interesting how that is just completely switched in our terminology. And now a computer is a machine that's doing that. We've got a lot of that kind of swap that's happened in our mind as we think about, between people and machines, that really has kind of blurred the lines for us as we're trying to understand what's happening with what are people capable of, what are machines capable of, and as those are converging in our current moment.
Andy, as I started doing some reading in preparation for this podcast, one of the things that shocked me about some of these models or these neural networks, because I watched a few videos and I read a few articles about this, is that, these neural networks learn iteratively, but their first passes, they try to learn something is mostly a guess. And what I was shocked about, I was watching a podcast about a neural network that was trying to identify handwritten numbers. And at first, the way it was presented, they said, well, maybe with a 9, there's a loop and then there's a stem. And maybe you get something that tries to identify a loop and a stem. But that was all just a conceptual thing for the viewer. What I realized later on is that there's no there. It has no understanding of a loop or a stem, and that model, no matter what your initial guess is, if you run enough iterations, will eventually get to the answer of a model that can identify handwritten numbers. And to use a biological model, maybe you could say that it's a cell without DNA. And it makes me wonder then, what is education and human mastery of a subject for if we can give that competence over to a machine? Or put another way, if, we were talking about ChatGPT writing our sermon, if it can write our sermon so easily, why would I put all the effort into learning how to do exegesis well or mastering the topic? For the people that might say, well, maybe ChatGPT can write your sermons and you'll learn some other part of pastoral ministry really well.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Let me unpack that a little bit. First, by explaining how an AI algorithm's able to do that. When we're talking about neural networks, they're based off of a very simple idea of an input, a hidden layer, and an output. And so what you were getting at, where you don't even need to necessarily do a lot of training on these AI models, where you can put in, as you mentioned, random variables into this hidden layer, and it can figure out, as you were talking about language or various other aspects of what you're seeking. It's kind of like with regards to people. Like I taught myself to juggle. I didn't need to know anything about juggling to begin with. We kind of come into the things that we do with varying levels of knowledge. There's no magic happening here. It goes back to the data. The data is going into the input layer. Doesn't really matter what the hidden variables are at. They can be a random state. But as that data is getting processed, it's going to fine tune that hidden variable to get the output. It's just important to kind of, I think, to appreciate what those algorithms are doing. And then it asks further questions to kind of go to what you're asking, because ultimately when we're using these technologies, we're using these technologies in what we would say are statistical ways of getting the outputs that we're looking for when we're asking it on the web. And you got to consider right now, data is digital gold, right? The more data, the better. Why? Because you need that data going through the algorithm from the input in through the hidden variable to the output. So when I'm asking ChatGPT or whatever to, write my sermon for me, it's taking the data that's on the web and it's processing it in certain ways to get my desired outcome, as an example. First of all, you have to think about it's running off of the back of human knowledge to begin with. However, the challenge here is, as you were mentioning, what now is the good of human knowledge? Is AI the last, invention that we'll ever create? Is it now just going to take what knowledge we've created and just continue on? Do I really need to learn a foreign language, for example, if I can just use, Google Translate? Do I need to learn how to write an essay if I can just use ChatGPT? Those are going to be really important questions I think we're going to have to consider. I was just talking with an AI researcher just this last week who's heavily involved in the AI community, both from a teaching perspective and at the research level. And this actually is one of his biggest concerns that you're mentioning here, Rick. His big concern is, well, are we just going to kind of outsource everything now? And are we going to stop becoming critical thinkers ourselves? Are we going to lose that capacity if we don't continue in this endeavor? And I don't have a great answer for you on that. I think that's where we're at the moment. And that's why I think a podcast like this is so important, because we got to talk about this. I know from an education perspective, people are rethinking the assignments that they give students. I'm doing the same thing, where it might be the fact that essays and research papers are the way of the past, and we have to now think of other ways of giving assignments, for example, where students can't use those technologies as easily to do the hard work of learning. So it's kind of a weird place, right? Where we've kind of learned ourselves into a corner if we're not careful.
Well, Andy, in your thesis, and I'm going to set us up to transition to our next episode, you talk a lot about what I'll characterize as this prolonged conversation between Alan Turing and Michael Polanyi. And could you tell us briefly who these people are, what their conversation was about, and why it's important for us now as we think about AI?
I actually think that their conversation is really helpful as we appreciate how we got to this historical moment and where we're going to go from here. Michael Polanyi was a Jewish Hungarian doctor / scientist. He was one of those polymaths. He was also, he was a physical chemist, but then he went into philosophy and brought him to the doors of theology. And he actually influenced a number of influential theologians, from T.F. Torrance to Leslie Newbegin and many others. But Polanyi's really, I think, insightful. He was one of those Jews that was working in Berlin when the Nazis came to power. He was one of those Jews that got expelled from Germany. And one of his big concerns before he even got expelled was the worldviews that were guiding the society, and how the society, those worldviews would guide the way the society would use technologies, and particularly how the society would view persons. And so because of his concern, even in the sciences, that's what drew him to philosophy. That's what drew him to theology, as he was concerned with the direction that culture was going. Now, I'm just going to pause there for a moment, because I think we're in an interesting moment where we have our own concern. I don't know if you guys have read Tom Holland's book, Dominion, for example, or seen how influential that book has been on atheists today. There are a lot of people in secular society that are kind of rethinking, what worldview am I embracing and where is it going to lead us? We've kind of been here before. Polanyi was one of those people that saw that. A lot of people saw that. C.S. Lewis saw that. There were a lot of people back in World War II leading, they had already gone through World War I. They're about to go, in this case, about to go through World War II and does go through World War II, had a profound impact on them, where they're looking at what is the worldview that led to this, and what kind of worldviews are we going to embrace to not go back to what just happened. And so you have to just appreciate that's what's going on in Polanyi's mind. He gets expelled from Germany, goes to Manchester, and now he's teaching in the UK at Manchester University, and he begins to encounter a guy by the name of Alan Turing. Alan Turing is a mathematician that was teaching at the time. He was concerned to answer Hilbert's decision problem, and in doing so, he invented what's referred to as the Turing machine and is viewed as the godfather of modern computing. And one of the big questions that he was asking, and that ultimately Polanyi and Turing began to debate each other on, was, could a machine think? Was that possible? Could we have a thinking machine? This is a question that people have been asking for a really long time. Now, both of these two guys, though, were coming at these questions from a very different worldview. Polanyi was coming at this question from the worldview of, maybe a good way to put it is, he wanted people to not lose sight of the human in the endeavor, that their worldview would keep sight of their humanity. Whereas Turing was more coming at this question from philosophical naturalism or a reductive physicalist perspective. And by that, those fancy terms, what I mean is, it was kind of a view of the world that the physical was all that there was. And that science, because if you looked at it from a perspective of just dealing with the physical, could answer all of life's questions. And so it was Turing very much imbibed a scientism perspective that technology could answer all of life's questions. It could do everything that a human could do, and you just needed enough computation. That's all that was necessary. And ultimately what you got, though, from these two different perspectives was, one, from Turing's perspective, yes, AI could become human because there really was nothing special about being human. Human was just a meat machine. It was just computation from a DNA perspective, but from his perspective, you could have the same computation from a silicon perspective. Whereas Polanyi was a worldview saying, no, there's something that is distinctly unique about being human, and that humans are different than machines. And this led into a bigger philosophical conversation.
Andy Steiger, thank you so much for being our guest on the Faith Trends podcast. This is the first of a two-part series, and we hope that our listeners will join us for the second one, where we're going to talk about AI and our cultural moment. And so we're going to look more at how we as Christians can and should respond and think about our interaction with AI. Andy's recently written a book called Reclaimed: How Jesus Restores Our Humanity in a Dehumanized World, and we're going to include links to that in the show notes. Andy, if people want to learn more about your work or how to contact you, how can they do that?
They could just go to apologeticscanada.com and they can learn all about me and the ministry that we do here at Apologetics Canada.
Thanks for listening to this intentionally ad-free podcast. Find out more about the EFC's research and how you can support it with a donation at theefc.ca/research.